Introductions for longer arguments are not a lot different than introductions for shorter arguments, but sometimes they need more context and sometimes they need more motivation for readers. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how to navigate those different issues. For a longer introduction, you definitely want to set up the background. I like to think of the introduction as a toolkit that you need to unlock all of the different things, the terminology, the argumentation, the situation itself. So you want to give context. You definitely need to establish the problem. So you can't jump into an argument just assuming that your reader understands what the problem is. You will need to define terminology, and I know we said no definitions, but those are definitions of words that everybody knows. So these are terms, things that people might not be aware of. Several people were reading the sample abstracts and didn't understand what the word recidivism meant. That is probably a word that a lot of people do know, but maybe in your audience they might not know. And a positive, which is simply a definition inside the sentence where you say recidivism, comma, which means, and then you go on with your sentence. That's a good way of handling terminology instead of a dictionary definition. And then you also probably want to establish the current conversation, and all of this has to happen very briefly and compact way without overloading the introduction with too much stuff. And so it's a fine balance, and we often want to think about our introduction and our conclusion and the rest of the body in terms of percentages, like how much of my paper should this introduction take. So there's no hard and fast rule about how long an introduction should be in a longer paper, but again, you want to think about balance. So it's not uncommon for an introduction to be 2 paragraphs, especially if you're including an anecdote, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you also want it to be easy to read, and you need a clear connection between 2 paragraphs, if there are 2 paragraphs, because most of us are going to be looking for that thesis at the end of your introductory paragraph. So if there are 2 paragraphs, it's got to be clear that the idea is continued and that we're building toward the thesis. We want to motivate readers, and one way of doing that is getting personal. So an anecdote is just a little personal story. And that's fine. I love a good anecdote at the beginning of an introduction or at the beginning of an essay, but it has to be relevant. You can't just tell a random story. It has to be true, and it also probably needs to belong to you. You can't just tell someone else's story, and it needs to be brief. One problem with an anecdote is that you could get way into a narrative. 3 pages later, we're finally getting to the introductory claims and to the thesis. We don't want that at all. And then you have to decide how the anecdote is going to play out in your essay. Is it something that you'll return to in the conclusion? Is that a good way to bookend your ideas? Or is it something that just gets us into the paper and then we move forward? And we'll look at some examples of how other students have used anecdotes to their advantage. You also want to think about universality. When you're thinking about a problem, it may not apply to everyone, but there's probably some element of it that does apply to everyone. So you want to think of a specific application with a universal connection. And that's really what makes good stories. It's what makes good novels and movies. And it's what makes good papers too. So if this problem can be connected to all readers in some way, even if it's just a very fundamental human way, I think that's usually a good way to think about it. We also can motivate readers with numbers, with statistics, but you'd be careful about statistics. Think very carefully before you just plop a statistic into your introduction. It needs to be from a credible source and a current source. If you're claiming that there's some sort of intersectional oppression, but you're citing a source from 1942, you probably have damaged your own credibility by not citing a more current source. You also really want to investigate your statistics. It's really easy to manipulate numbers. So think about where those statistics came from, who commissioned that survey or that sample size, and if the sample size is not very large, then maybe you ought to reconsider using that as an attention-grabbing motivation for your readers. You also now need to think about your topic. So what what kinds of motivation will be helpful for you in your paper. In class today, we will discuss your topics in small groups, and we'll think about what type of motivation seems best for your topic. Not everybody can use an anecdote because it just doesn't work for every paper. But you might need to use a combination of statistics and some sort of situational context that will help motivate your readers. How do you plan to motivate your readers without overplaying your pathos card, without threatening doom? If we don't do something about this, the whole world is going to fall apart. The sky is going to descend upon us. You need to work towards an objective and measured tone in your introduction and in your conclusion as well. We're going to read all in these model introduction in this week's module, and then I want you to be prepared in class to discuss which ones are immediately interesting to you. And we're going to compare notes in class groups and in our large class discussion. So after you watch this video, you need to go directly over to the module and look at our sample introduction packet. We're also going to look at some conclusions, and why are we thinking about conclusions when we're not even writing the paper yet? It's because the introduction and the conclusion are tied together. And if you remember our Christmas tree model, the trunk of the tree goes all the way up and down and it unites everything together. The introduction should not simply reappear as the conclusion, but it should have ideas that are connected. And so we're going to look at all 4 conclusions. We're going to think about these questions, how they extend and build on the introductions, how they go beyond summary. And they should ask us where we go from here, what should we be doing, what things can we be thinking about as we leave this essay and this investigation into this problem. So we'll also be comparing notes in that large group. So your job today is to have prepared those things prior to class. Now, we're also going to look at works cited pages, and I'm going to ask you to make some observations about the types and the currency of those sources and the variation of those sources, and we'll be talking about how those sources can be important in our introductions and conclusions, even if we're not citing a bunch of different sources and engaging in a dialogue like we would in the body of an essay. So Micro 5, the introduction, is due this Thursday, October 15th. And of course, it will have a heading and a working title. It will be typed, and you're going to send it via email to me and to your group by class time at 8 or 12:40. We're going to come a little later into class like we did with our rough drafts and do some peer review with those, but you should have them in your inboxes no later than class time. And more information about how class is going to work will come this week as well. We're going to review according to the directions in the module. There'll be a peer review guide for the introduction, and you should be following that closely so that you have good feedback to give your peers. You are doing great with peer feedback. Some of the feedback we got on thesis statements was incredibly insightful, and it made for really good revised thesis statements, so keep that in mind. Also, remember that your book review is due October 22nd. We have a book review workshop coming up, but you should be reading that book. You should have that book in your possession if you don't have it just yet, and you should be making notes on that book as well. Introductions are incredibly important for setting the stage for our rough drafts, and once we get this introduction hammered out and revised, you're going to feel like you have a really strong purchase in this paper, and you're also going to have 1 or 2 pages already written, which also feels pretty good. So I'll see you in class with your introductions.